Hello, welcome to video 2 of Foundational Skills in Psychedelic-Assisted Psychotherapy. In video 1 in the Foundational Skills series, we talked about a few concepts. We talked about the non-directive approach, pacing of sessions, the use of silence. We talked about foundational skills such as prompting, mirroring, deepening prompts. And at this point in the training course, you should have some understanding also of how those things are all affected by the dose. So today, I'd like to just go over a couple other skill sets that I teach to trainees. And we'll go through those somewhat briefly and talk about how those might show up for you. And you can use this information to build on the beginning skills we talked about in the last video. So, number 1, recognizing and working with resistance. Resistance often shows up in the first session or first few, especially in clients who have anxiety about the process. And it often looks one of two ways. One is a lot of grounding or orienting behaviors. This is the client who really doesn't drop out of a place where they are continuing to try to track what's going on in ordinary reality. They may be touching their body, touching the chair, trying to look at their watch, asking you what time it is, looking around the room, taking their eye shades off, making eye contact with you, saying things like, is my partner still in the waiting room? How much time has passed? They're trying to stay very present. This is not at all uncommon, and this is a form of resistance to fully falling into or relaxing into the effects of the medicine, and usually comes from a place of some anxiety and wanting to feel a little bit more in control of what's happening. And so they constantly are bringing their attention to what's going on in the room. Another form of resistance to the medicine is excessive talkativeness or chattiness. People who just talk, keep like a sort of verbal exchange going the whole time, or narrating a lot, or asking for a lot of back and forth, not necessarily overtly asking for reassurance, just talking about things, like talking about their day, talking about what happened yesterday, just chit-chatting almost, and trying to keep from dropping in. So don't be surprised if these sorts of things come up when you begin working with clients. Both of those patterns are usually a form of discomfort with feeling altered and not being sure how comfortable they are with it. It's very strange. And so what I teach clinicians to do here is to offer an invitation prompt for the person to drop more into the medicine effects, to relax into it. Lay back, close your eyes. Why don't we take a moment and not talk, or have a silent moment and just see what you notice, or see if you can just lean into the effects of the medicine a little bit, that kind of a language. Sometimes I've used language like when people are not sure what that means, I'll say it's kind of like falling asleep and dreaming, except you are still awake and you can talk to me if you want. So just like letting yourself dream, letting dreams come. So that's something I've sometimes said, but any language that allows the person to be invited to drop in, to lean into the altered and more psychedelic properties of the experience, rather than keeping themselves like in the three-dimensional room with you, which is what they're sort of instinctually trying to do. So I teach trainees to offer that prompt, and then I teach trainees to only offer it once. This is not a hard and fast rule, but in general, the idea is to give them that invitation, and if they do lean into that, and if that goes smoothly and they move and they're comfortable, then great. If they don't really want to do that, and this is not rare, this happens a lot, if they resist that idea and they say no, they want to stay in that mode of like orienting, grounding, checking with you, talking to you a lot, like staying in the the sort of more typical psychotherapy space, then what I teach is to allow them to do that. You definitely don't want to sort of violate their natural sense of keeping themselves, in some sense of control or safety by pushing them into something that they're not ready for. So then you just work with the resistance. So you can name it. You can say, okay, so we're noticing that, you're wanting to track the time and really keep track of what's going on in the room here with me. So let's just notice that that's what's happening. Give them the time, give them all the information that they ask for. Is my partner in the waiting room? Yes, they're out there. Do you want me to have someone check? Yes, whatever it is that let them meet them where they're at, and let them do what they need to do to track the fact that there's a real world going on, and then there's this possibility of getting altered, and they're sort of in that place of not being sure what to do with that, but that they can access the real world and the safety and the validity of that if they need to. Usually, you may spend a whole session doing that, just letting them pay attention to this dynamic, letting them get all the sort of feedback that they need, and that's it. What usually happens is, as you talk about that in integration, that turns into a validating experience where they then are less afraid of the medicine because they understand that they can lean in or they cannot. So it doesn't feel like something that's going to grab them in a really out of controlled way. And they've reassured themselves that they have the ability to talk or move or track time or all of those things if that's important to them. And then also, as a clinician, note that this may be relevant for whatever your client is working for or their particular personality type if there are dynamics around control and safety and so on. And then obviously track that for the work that you're going to do going forward. So the nutshell of that is recognizing it, offering that initial prompt to invite them to lean in, so, with that initial suggestion, and then if they don't choose to do that or would rather not do that, it's just letting them stay in the place that they're at and work with the resistance and allow them to work through that. Okay, second skill that I wanted to raise today is this idea that I often pull into conversation when I'm doing supervision with trainees of what we call the triangle, and I'll put a triangle on the screen here. We call this the triangle between body, emotion, and story. And I get some of my language around this from one of my teachers, Cater Brown, who has often used the phrase with me of like moving around the triangle. And so what that means is that this is not specific to the beginning of a session. This is just working with anybody on psychedelics at any time. And obviously it can be relevant for other kinds of mindfulness states or therapy work as well. So at the top of your triangle is story. This can also include images. This is what you're experiencing, what you're telling yourself is going on with you, a sort of narrative that you might share verbally, images, or even memories. And then on the bottom of the triangle, you have your body and emotions. So I teach therapists to do this technique of moving around this triangle throughout their work with their clients on psychedelic medicines because a lot of processing, a lot of content, and a lot of healing processes that clients move through are not happening on the level of story or image, the top of that triangle. That's where your sort of cognitive awareness is. Sometimes the work that's being done isn't registering on a cognitive level. The client may not be able to communicate verbally like, this is what I think is happening. You may need to track what's happening on the level of their physical body and their emotions. And you may want to help them track that as well. So it doesn't mean that you have to be constantly asking them about all three of these things. What it does mean, though, is if a session is moving along in a somewhat useful way, you feel like it's making a sort of natural progress, and then you and the client get to a place where things are kind of stuck, they're not sure what's happening, they don't feel like it's making sense, or there's any kind of shift where you don't feel like the things are naturally moving as much in the session, you want to prompt yourself to consider whether you need to move to another place on that triangle, and then prompt your client to do that. So a common thing this could look like would be they're working through something, a conflict in their life, and they're sort of talking about it. And then they get to a point where that's just not showing up anymore, and they sort of lose that trail of tracking it, and sort of nothing's happening on that level. You want to invite the client using mindfulness, teach them how to check in with themselves and notice what's happening sort of all by itself in their body. What are they feeling? And they may often express like a pressure in the chest, or a tightness in the throat, or a stomach, or their head feeling buzzy, or a lot of different kinds of somatic feelings. And then you move into noticing and prompting language around that, just like you would with any other content that we've talked about, and let them deepen into the somatic awareness. You can move into somatic interventions if you have that skill set, making sure that you have consent fully around any kind of touch that you're using. Make sure you've seen my earlier video on that before doing any of this kind of work. But you're allowing then the process to unfold on a somatic level. So at this point, the client may not be cognitively tracking this. They may not be at the top of the triangle with story, and they may not be getting images or memories that they can really describe. It may be a lot of just body sensation, and they don't understand it, but it's shifting or moving, or their body is feeling different things, and you are responding to that either with somatic interventions or just verbally helping them track it mindfully and noticing it. Noticing if it shifts when they bring their attention to it, noticing what else comes with it. If you notice that body sensation and stay with it, then maybe thoughts or memories start coming up that are different, right? So moving over to the emotion corner of the triangle, it's the same idea. You could equally have moved to just asking them to notice what they're feeling emotionally. They don't have a story attached. What is the emotion that you're feeling? And sometimes you move from emotion back to body, back to story, and moving around. So this is the moving around the triangle. So this is really valuable for when you are at an impasse, or when things have been moving and then all of a sudden something isn't moving. It may be that you need to shift to one of the other corners of the triangle. So many of us, especially many clients, operate more in that that story top of the triangle. The part where they're telling themselves, they're experiencing things that they can narrate or sort of understand on some level cognitively, describe, and that often have imagery attached, right? So most people sort of naturally operate on that level, and they don't as intuitively tune into or process somatically or track their emotions as much, so you need to prompt them to that. That being said, the inverse is true, where some people are naturally very somatic in the way that they process or experience things. So some clients will really come in with most of the ketamine session happening on a somatic body level. They will be feeling things in their body almost from the beginning. Almost everything that's happening will be different sensations moving around in their body. And so you can work with that, and you can also, if that starts to feel stuck, move over to asking about emotions, having them really check in with what they're feeling emotionally, or moving up to, are there any images or thoughts or memories that are coming up, and move around that way, and so on. So I think that it's probably intuitive to most of you watching that could be true for any corner of the triangle. And so it's really reminding yourself as a therapist that all three levels are happening at once, and that you can sort of move between those levels as you need to with the client throughout the session, and that this often helps the fluidity or the sort of organic unfolding of a session happen. So it helps to have some skill set with language around how to prompt mindfulness in a client. So I won't go into that here, but that's something that you guys can make sure you have a sort of script in mind for how to talk a client through mindfulness, and scanning their internal experience, so that if you need to move around this triangle, you have language that you can use for that with the client. Okay, the last thing I wanted to put in the video today is some skill sets or interventions around the peak state or the mystical state. This is not usually something that therapists worry about. Most therapists are comfortable sitting with a client while they're having a positive, euphoric, or sort of transformative positive experience. Usually the concerns I get from trainees are more about how to handle scary or dysphoric states. So frightening or fear-based states I'm going to talk about in the next video as its own topic. But I will today mention just a couple skills for when a client is having a very powerful transpersonal experience, often love-based or compassion-based, or interpreted by them as spiritual. These are very compelling and very moving moments in a session. And this is not something that you need to steer. It's just something that you want to reflect back. And there's very simple techniques that you can bring in just to enhance the meaning of that experience for the integration phase later. One, which is really basic, is taking notes, writing down what they're describing and what they're saying. Ask them for deepening prompts if they're not giving you, if they're able to verbalize it a little more to you so you can write it down for them, as long as you're doing that in a way that's not disruptive to their process. So take notes on what they're describing is happening. Direct quotes can be really powerful, like, quote, this is what the person's saying. And then you have a record of that to share with them later and to talk about in integration. Because remember, if you've seen my video on integration, the whole power of the experience really happens in integration when you can hopefully weave it into the client's life going forward in a meaningful way. Okay, so note-taking. A second thing that you can use in those moments is what we call a message to the future self. What this refers to is the phenomenon that often when a client is in an expanded state of awareness, they're operating from what we might call wise mind, or they have a more elevated understanding of what's happening in their life, so they have more insight. Clients will often acknowledge this verbally. Even if they don't, it's usually happening, which is that they have a realization that they understand something, maybe an epiphany or a felt sense of something being true, that they are going to probably lose when they sober up. So sometimes clients will say, I see this now, but I know that like tomorrow I won't be able to see this because, I'll be in my normal awareness state. So message to the future self is optional, but if it feels appropriate in the moment, you can invite the client to think of a message or advice that they would give to their future self, their ordinary awareness self. So what understanding do they have as their altered state self that they want to teach or remind themselves and when they're in their ordinary reality, in the next few days. And then let them, they can check in with themselves and see if there's words that they want to put to that's authentic to them. You can also record that or write that down for them. And then the third intervention, it's for sort of mystical or peak experiences, is what I call a touchstone. A touchstone is similar to the message to the future self, but it's a little bit less on the kind of teachy cognitive level. Touchstone is anchoring the felt sense of the experience in a way that you could later, down the road, prompt the client back to some memory of the felt sense of what they're experiencing. So this is coming up with something that they can, it could be an object. It's often a gesture. Sometimes it can come from them, but it's usually a conversation like, what can we use to bring you back to this awareness or a memory of this awareness in the future? There's a lot of ways to do this that we can talk more in more advanced trainings as far as ways to do this in sophisticated sort of patient or client-specific ways. But for purposes of today, a simple one is a gesture, like you can invite them to put their own hand on their chest. Really notice whatever that spiritual or emotionally affirming awareness that they're having, that expansive awareness they're having. notice it, really just sort of bathe in it, and then notice their hand on their chest and how the sensation of the hand on the chest is anchoring that felt sense, and then have them see what they feel in their body and in their emotions and in their awareness, and have them notice how also have the hand on their chest. Like I said, you can also do it with a piece of music or an object. There's a lot of ways you could use the touchstone. A gesture like that is one, but it's something that you do that's like anchors the experience in a action that the client can take later. And then you can use that later in integration. You can actually tell the client to close their eyes and to drop into sort of a mindfulness state. Talk them, through how to drop into mindfulness. And then remembering your experience that you had on the medicine, bring your hand to your chest and see if that will help prompt a sort of felt sense memory of the experience. So that's a third technique that we sometimes use to anchor and deepen those experiences. Okay, so I've listed a few somewhat unrelated skill sets today, just to sort of give you some additional things to use. So we've talked about working with resistance, we've talked about the triangle, and we've talked about some skills to use for mystical or peak experiences to help make them more valuable for the person's sort of therapy outcome. So I hope that was helpful as well, and I'll see you for video 3 of foundational skills, which is going to talk a lot about fear and what to do when clients are afraid on the medicine. So I'll see you then.